Hey guys, tonight we're headed somewhere warm, draped in linen, and teetering on the edge of fashion disaster. Imagine it's Rome, yes, that Rome, with the marble temples, the echoing baths, the wheeled carts creaking down cobbled alleys, and the faint aroma of roasted dormice wafting from a street vendor's brazier. You're wearing a toga because everyone is, and you're tugging at it every few steps, trying to make it sit right without tripping over the hem. It's stiff, uncooperative, and folds like a stubborn bedsheet. The sun beats down on white, stone everywhere you go, and your sandals are already hot. You pass a few locals dressed much more daringly, with their togas pulled tighter and trimmed higher, and you wonder, not for the first time, how anyone survives this without collapsing from heat or humiliation. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're waking up in a Rome you've never quite seen before. Not the Rome of marching legions or crumbling empires, but one where a toga could trigger a scandal, where clothing was not just cloth, but a statement of status, morality, and sometimes a petty feud. And this particular morning, something strange is brewing. You shuffle out into the street just as the town criers begin their rounds, unrolling their parchment and announcing a new decree with all the solemnity of someone reading out a dinner menu. The emperor, they say, Publius Helvius Pertinax, is cracking down on indecent drapery. You blink. Did they just say indecent? You're wearing 8 layers and can't see your own feet. But apparently, the younger senators and sons of equestrians have been making their togas tighter, slimmer, trendier. Fewer folds, less cloth, more thigh. It's scandalous, you're told, although some of the older crowd seems more nostalgic than offended. One elderly senator leans on his cane and mutters something about back in my day and proper pleats. The city is abuzz, and you can feel it in the market chatter, the gossip drifting out of bathhouses, and the slightly more theatrical sashaying of the fashion-forward crowd, who now seem to take the decree as a challenge rather than a warning. Pertinax, of course, is not exactly a villain. He's earnest. Formerly a teacher and military commander, he rose to power after the chaotic assassination of Commodus, who was more famous for his gladiator cosplay than good governance. Pertinax tried to bring order back to a Rome that had become, well, flamboyant. And part of that, apparently, included a reformation of clothing. He wasn't the first Roman ruler to think people's outfits reflected the empire's moral state. Augustus, long before, had launched similar campaigns, encouraging modesty and traditional Roman virtues. And that included dressing like your grandfather, even if your grandfather smelled like goat cheese and senatorial privilege. But this was different. Tight togas weren't just a matter of personal preference. They were a social rebellion. In a society where clothing literally draped your status across your body, making it tighter, sleeker, and more revealing suggested a casual disregard for the hierarchy, and perhaps even worse, an embrace of foreign styles. Those tighter folds, some say they were inspired by Eastern fashions, or worse, Alexandrian tailoring. And in the eyes of traditionalists like Pertinax, this was no mere style trend. It was a signal of decadence, disrespect, and danger. Historians still argue whether Pertinax truly cared about fashion, or whether the so-called toga edict was a minor detail blown out of proportion by later commentators. There's debate over whether such a ban was ever widely enforced or simply proposed. But here's what we do know. In Roman culture, modesty was more than a private virtue. It was a public necessity. You could be mocked, exiled, or even fined for dressing improperly. A too short tunic or a toga without the proper colour, or stripe could signify everything from low birth to political treason. And that morning, as you wander through the forum, watching the senator's assistant carefully arrange his master's toga so it drapes just so over one arm, you start to realise how much anxiety is wrapped up in those folds. There's even a guy off to the side whose entire job is toga management, a professional toga wrapper, if you will. making sure his client doesn't sit down the wrong way and accidentally expose a knee. And while you giggle at the absurdity of it, part of you feels the pressure. Clothing here is performance. It's identity. It's surveillance. You make your way past the Temple of Vesta, where the sacred flame flickers quietly, and into a shaded colonnade where vendors are already gossiping about the decree. One older woman, folding linen with the precision of a surgeon, snorts and mutters, "He wants looser togas? Fine. I'll make them so loose he trips over his own sense of virtue." Another vendor chimes in, whispering that his cousin just got fined for wearing something that was technically a tunic, but felt too Greek. And the question swirls in your mind like dust in the sunlight. How did a city that built aqueducts and conquered half the known world become so obsessed with fabric ratios? It's not as strange as it seems. Clothing in ancient Rome was a visual shorthand for your place in the world. Were you a citizen or a slave, married or single, wealthy or merely pretending? The width of your stripe, the color of your hem, even the fabric weight could say more than a resume ever could. Pertinax's crackdown was in some ways an attempt to rewind the cultural clock. But Rome, with its noisy streets and ever-changing tastes, doesn't rewind easily. And as you watch a group of young men laughing in the sun, their togas hitched slightly higher for ease of movement, or maybe just to show off those legs, you can already tell this decree is going to backfire spectacularly. Still, for now, the town criers keep announcing it with all the seriousness they can muster, as if the fate of the empire hangs on a waistband. Somewhere, a pigeon coos from the roof of the Senate. A stray dog sniffs a dropped fig. And in the heart of the city, Rome begins its slow, absurd march into fashion history. You wake the next morning to the distinct sound of sandals slapping against stone, mingled with the murmured grumbling of bureaucrats already hard at work, drafting the official guidelines for toga compliance. Apparently, yesterday's announcement was only the overture. Today, the machinery of Roman governance is grinding into gear, distributing edicts on parchment and wax tablets like overly earnest wedding invitations. Scrolls are tacked up outside bathhouses. Graffitied announcements appear on neighborhood walls in ink that still drips with bureaucratic fervor. And a poorly illustrated pamphlet is circulating through the Suburra, depicting stick figure Romans with proper and improper toga folds. It's as if Rome itself has decided that clothing is now the top item on its imperial to-do list. You step into the morning light and are immediately greeted by the sight of an entrepreneurial tailor who's slapped a freshly painted sign over his doorway that reads, "Togae Maximus, the virtue is in the volume." Beside him are competing shop counters with wholesome drapery for decent citizens, guaranteed to hide every indecency. There's already a line of nervous young equestrians clutching purse strings and trying to look appropriately serious. Never underestimate how fast the Roman economy can pivot in the face of absurd legislation. One of them, clearly flustered, turns to you and whispers, "How many folds do you think are enough folds?" You answer with a shrug. Who can say? Historians still argue whether Pertinax's decree was backed by a formal committee or whether it emerged from a single sleepless night of moral panic and indigestion. Either way, the toga has become a political lightning rod. And in Rome, when something becomes political, it also becomes theatrical. By the time you make it to the forum, the absurdity has reached full parade. A group of orators has gathered on the rostra, not to discuss grain prices or military campaigns, but to weigh in on appropriate toga circumference. One of them waves a long scroll dramatically and reads aloud a fabricated, ancient statute of Tiberius that supposedly banned shameful drapery suggestive of barbarian softness. It's nonsense, but the crowd eats it up. A few clapped-out philosophers argue that the true Roman toga was never meant to flatter the body, but to cloak it in the austere folds of republican virtue. Others counter that such modesty was only for show, citing portraits of emperors whose sculpted physiques were clearly emphasized beneath well-placed pleats. A pickpocket moves deftly among them, perhaps the only person truly benefiting from the swelling audience. Behind the crowd, vendors have begun selling novelty brooches labelled "Pin It for Pertinax," shaped like tiny frowny-faced emperors. You catch sight of a troupe of actors from the theatre of Pompey, performing a comedic sketch involving two senators trying, and failing, to get into a toga large enough for both of them. It ends with one shouting, "This is no longer a garment, it's a siege engine!" and collapsing in mock exhaustion. Even the grumpiest onlookers crack a smile. There's something delightfully Roman about all this, taking a ridiculous law and turning it into an opportunity for satire, theatre, commerce, and debate, sometimes all at once. You continue your stroll, winding past the temples of Castor and Pollux, where a group of Vestal virgins seems to be pretending they don't hear the latest song being sung by nearby schoolchildren. The lyrics go something like, "Tight togas go, let virtue show," or "Pertinax will scream and crow." Catchy. Further, along in a quiet courtyard shaded by olive trees, a circle of young scholars debates whether the decree can be interpreted as a revival of Numa's moral code. One of them quotes a fragment from Livy about how early Roman attire was modest and plain, while another points out that Roman values have always included a flair for contradiction. Gladiators in loincloths, after all, were often government-sponsored. A third sighs and mutters, "We study Cicero, and the empire gives us fashion police." They nod solemnly, as if the toga itself now embodies the very soul of Roman contradiction. Modesty versus spectacle, control versus identity, fabric as metaphor. In the residential hills, senators grow increasingly anxious. You pass by one house, where a tailor is desperately pinning extra cloth to an already expansive toga, while a servant recites a checklist aloud. Proper shoulder exposure, minimal. Knees, obscured. Waistline, unidentifiable. Inside, the senator paces, muttering about an upcoming appearance before the emperor and whether his draping suggests insufficient gravitas. His wife, seated with a cup of wine, watches the scene unfold with practiced disinterest. "Just wear your old consular robes," she advises. "They make you look like a respectable sofa." He doesn't laugh. There's a rumour, after all, that Pertinax has commissioned a panel of moral inspectors, dubbed, half-mockingly, the Togati Regulares, who will begin issuing public reprimands. Whether this is true or simply satire that got out of hand remains unclear. But the fear is real. Romans, despite their bravado, hate public shaming more than plague or tax hikes. As the sun climbs higher, the heat begins to test the limits of moral decorum. You spot several young men near the Field of Mars discreetly loosening their togas in the shade. One attempts to convert his into a sort of makeshift hammock between two columns. This, he explains with an exaggerated sigh, is the true Roman innovation, adaptive fashion. A companion adds, "We should submit this to the emperor as the relaxed virtue model." They all chuckle and sip watered-down wine. You overhear one remark that if they're forced to wear heavier togas, the Senate should at least compensate them with iced honey drinks. Someone else wonders aloud if toga weight subsidies might be the next populist promise. Later in the afternoon, you cross paths with a barber who offers a curious insight. Apparently, ever since the decree, men have been requesting cleaner shaves and more sharply defined profiles. "If you must hide the body," he explains, "then the face becomes your only canvas." The implication is clear. As togas expand, so too does the importance of grooming. In fact, at least one perfumery has begun marketing a scent called Fragrance of Virtue, which smells suspiciously like myrrh mixed with melted beeswax. Still, it's flying off the shelves. There's always profit in virtue, or the appearance of it. You finally return to your neighborhood and find a group of children playing a game they've invented called Senate or Shame. One child stands in the center and poses with various toga styles, while the others shout out either Senate or Shame, depending on how much shin is visible. The game devolves into laughter, particularly when one boy wraps himself in a bedsheet and declares, "I am the ghost of Julius Caesar, and I find your folds disappointing." His mother nearby rolls her eyes and returns to pounding garum into a clay pot. As twilight falls, Rome begins to soften. Lanterns flicker to life, casting warm glows on the city's impossibly old walls. You sit outside a taverna, sipping lukewarm wine, and listen as a travelling bard sings a new ballad called The Emperor and the Dangerous Drape. The lyrics are overly poetic, and the tune drifts off key, but the crowd listens anyway. They laugh at the parts where the emperor trips over his own moral code and cheer when the people rebel not with weapons, but with clever tailors and double-stitched rebellion. You wonder, as the stars begin to poke through the haze, whether the decree will hold. Rome, after all, is a city that survives emperors, laws, and the occasional moral panic. Maybe this whole toga affair will pass like a summer storm, leaving behind only soggy scrolls and a few dusty anecdotes for future historians to debate. Or maybe it will linger. Another symbol in the long, slow march of Rome's attempt to police virtue through thread count. Either way, for now, the city sleeps beneath its blankets of marble and sky, wrapped in enough drapery to keep the senses satisfied, if not impressed. The morning mist is still curling low over the Tiber as you stir from sleep, the sort of soft Roman dawn where the only real sound is the lazy clinking of amphorae being stacked by an overworked wine merchant already late for his delivery route. Your shoulder is slightly sore, likely from sleeping in the same awkward position after wrapping yourself in a toga blanket the night before, a decision that seemed whimsical then, but now serves as a reminder of just how many folds are too many. You shake off the stiffness, rub your eyes, and shuffle to the open window just in time to catch your neighbor unrolling his new compliance edition toga. Twice dyed, triple hemmed, and so absurdly voluminous that it briefly blocks the view of the Palatine Hill. They said more folds, he says flatly when he notices you staring. Now I have more folds than a political scandal. You nod sympathetically and make a mental note not to stand too close behind him when walking uphill. The emperor's edict, once laughed off by skeptics, is now gripping the capital with the quiet tyranny of fast-moving social panic. Everyone seems unsure where the boundary lies between obedient drapery and excessive flounce, and so the general approach is simply more fabric, more virtue. The senatorial class is in a tizzy. Word is, inspections are happening, not officially, of course, but through the subtle glances of imperial lictors who just happen to be present during morning prayers or evening strolls. No scrolls are being handed out yet, but one senator was allegedly questioned about whether his tunic was visible beneath his toga, which would suggest an inappropriate inner garment awareness. He has since vanished to his countryside villa, with a satchel of wool and a very shaken scribe. His neighbours have taken note and now discuss acceptable opacity with the kind of hushed tones once reserved for temple gossip. Historians still argue whether these inspections were state-sponsored or simply the byproduct of a culture that feared shame more than tax audits. But one thing is certain. The toga, once a semi-optional social formality, has become an obsessive public performance. Even the statues are being affected. In the Campus Martius, a group of artists has been commissioned to retrofit existing marble busts with virtue folds, carefully chiseled extensions of cloth that seem to bloom out of the stone torsos like blooming fabric mushrooms. One particularly tragic statue of a victorious general now appears to be drowning in a toga tidal wave, his once triumphant arm barely visible under the swirling drapery. Your own day begins with a visit to the barbershop, a decision born less from vanity and more from survival. If your toga is now meant to hide every contour of your body, then surely your face is the last defense against complete visual obscurity. The barber is more philosopher than stylist, gently massaging your temples as he offers commentary on the social ripple effect of Pertinax's decree. You know, he murmurs, we used to ask whether a man's eyes told the truth. Now, it's whether his shoulders suggest rebellion. You let out a sleepy chuckle as he adds, I had a client yesterday who requested a fold-compliant moustache. You ask what that means. He wanted it to swoop left and right like a draped curtain. You pause, then nod slowly. That's commitment. Later, as he oils your face with something that smells like basil and confusion, You realize this is the closest thing you've had to political discourse all week. As you make your way through the forum, the scale of the toga frenzy becomes even clearer. Tailors are now operating out of pop-up stalls, some of them offering on-the-spot toga adjustments like overzealous hairdressers. One even has a miniature measuring rod and a chart that reads, "Virtue versus volume, find your proper ratio." Nearby, a pretentious Greek philosopher delivers an impromptu lecture titled "On the Geometry of Modesty," complete with wax tablets and diagrams. According to him, the angle of the third fold from the shoulder indicates the moral standing of the wearer's ancestors. You suspect he may be making this up, but the audience, including several high-ranking magistrates, nods solemnly, perhaps out of fear of looking uneducated. As you pass by the Senate House, you spot a newly carved inscription above the entrance. Virtus in toga, non in musculis. Virtue lies in the toga, not in the muscles. It's unclear whether this is official policy or just graffiti, but given the quality of the lettering, someone paid a mason for it. Rome's moral compass is now a textile guideline. Midday finds you seeking relief from the growing heat beneath a shaded colonnade. There, a gathering of merchants sits in a circle, sharing complaints over diluted wine and olives. "My couriers keep tripping," one says, pulling a sample of the new state-approved toga from a bag. "It's heavy enough to make a donkey wince." "And don't get me started on storage," another mutters. "I had to build a second closet just for one outfit." A third raises a skeptical eyebrow. "It's all politics. Make everyone so tangled up in folds they can't remember the bread prices are up again." The group falls silent, chewing thoughtfully on their olives. You glance around and realize that everyone present is wearing the same exaggerated blanket-like garment that makes them resemble escaped members of a Roman opera. A few children dash past, trailing miniature togas that flap like sails. The older one turns to the younger and yells, "You're dishonoring the Republic," before leaping into a fountain. The splash is both theatrical and oddly appropriate. Later, in the garden of a wealthy matron who's invited you to a poetry reading, you find the upper class turning toga compliance into a competitive art form. The poet herself stands on a small marble dais, wearing what can only be described as a toga fortress, layer upon layer of cascading wool, embroidered with tiny gold laurels. "This piece," she says breathlessly, "is titled In Praise of Modest Drapery." She recites an epic about fabric as resistance, as identity, as shield, as virtue incarnate. Every stanza is followed by polite applause and the occasional discreet yawn. One guest whispers that she's commissioned a special summer toga woven from linen and peacock feather threads, designed to be both voluminous and breezy. Another says his uncle in Carthage has started a side business exporting excess toga fabric to the provinces where locals think it's a new form of Roman punishment. A third, clearly irritated, mutters, "Why not just wear a tent and call it a toga?" Nobody laughs. The joke hits a little too close to home. As dusk falls and torches are lit along the streets, the city begins to settle into a kind of quiet, resignation. The edict, absurd as it once seemed, has woven itself into the fabric of daily life, literally and figuratively. Toga conversations dominate dinner tables. Lovers flirt by complimenting each other's hemlines. Tailors are now minor. Celebrities, and even the cats, lounging atop warm stones, seem slightly confused by the abundance of flowing cloth dragging across the streets. You wander home beneath the darkening sky, passing a beggar who's stitched two old blankets together in what might technically qualify as a conformant toga. He grins at you and says, "Still warmer than my last house." You drop him a coin and he offers you a wink. Rome, even at its most ridiculous, finds a way to carry on. You reach your doorstep just as a distant crier announces a new addendum to the decree, a recommendation, though not yet a requirement, that all togas worn in the presence of imperial statues should be of light neutral tones, so as not to visually compete with marble. You sigh, already picturing the arguments that will erupt tomorrow in the dye shops. Still, you can't help but smile. There's something comforting about a city so old and sprawling, so powerful and strange, being utterly consumed by the question of whether a man's knees should ever be seen in public. As you step inside and unpin your own toga for the evening, the folds drop to the floor in a soft, woolen sigh. You exhale, stretch your arms, and for the first time all day, feel truly unburdened. The first glimmers of morning sunlight sneak through the narrow slats of your window shutters, casting long, angled shadows across the walls of your modest Roman dwelling. You roll over slowly, half tangled in your nighttime version of a toga, a slightly shabbier, looser number meant only for sleeping, which now feels like trying to wriggle out of a woolen sea creature. You groan and mutter something incoherent about needing a decree just for pajama reform. Rising groggily, you open the shutters fully, and the soft breeze that enters smells faintly of baked bread, incense, and the ever so persistent undertone of wet cobblestone. Rome is waking up again, and somewhere not far off, the city's great toga panic continues to unfold, like a bolt of wool thrown down the Capitoline steps. You dress methodically, stacking each layer of cloth like a patient, preparing to be mummified. You've begun to measure your dignity in pleats now, which is both absurd and depressingly practical. Once you're fully armored in moral fabric, you step into the street, where the city already buzzes with restless conversations and shifting hems. Down in the marketplace, vendors bark over crates of garum jars, olive bunches, and steaming loaves of honey bread, but their shouts are increasingly interrupted by whispers of toga compliance. Heard they turned away a priest at the Temple of Jupiter. Hem wasn't symmetrical, mutters a fish seller as he slaps down a particularly angry sea bass. Another man, wearing the expression of someone who spent the morning inside a wool furnace, points to his shoulder and grumbles, "Mine's compliant." Too compliant, I can't feel my left arm. Children dart between stall legs, giggling and pointing at the occasional passerby whose toga flutters a bit too freely. A woman, presumably their mother, hisses after them, "Show respect! That man might be a censor." The children freeze in delighted horror and scamper away again, pretending to drape themselves in invisible robes. You pause beside a fruit stand, examining a suspiciously mushy fig, when a local tailor recognizes you and sidles up like a conspirator. "Friend," he whispers, eyes darting. "I've invented a hidden clasp system. Keeps everything tidy. Compliant. Without the bulk. Interested?" He raises an eyebrow. "First one's free. Word of mouth is all I ask." You decline politely, though the idea of turning your toga into a covert transformer is deeply tempting. As you cross the forum, a new sight catches your attention. A line of toga-clad petitioners snaking toward the praetor's office, each nervously, checking their folds, tugging at seams, and whispering frantic mantras about dignity and proportional draping. One man ahead of you is visibly sweating through 3 layers of wool. He turns and blurts, "I added an extra fold this morning, and now I can't remember which one is the original." Another woman frets that her hem grazed the ground and may have committed an accidental public filth offence. You wonder silently whether anyone is still focused on actual petitions, or whether every grievance now simply revolves around wardrobe. Dilemmas. Historians still argue, you recall hearing a scholar mumble at a bathhouse lecture, whether these daily performances of piety were genuine virtue or mass hallucination. Watching a magistrate deny an applicant with a curt wave and an insincere, "You're flouncing too triumphantly," you're inclined to side with the hallucination theory. Your path leads you next to the outskirts of the Subura, the grittier, more crowded district of Rome where the toga rules twist into even stranger shapes. Here, practicality wrestles with politics. Many labourers opt for modified half-togas, nicknamed togalites, which look suspiciously like large napkins, but are defended with long-winded philosophical arguments. One cart driver argues loudly to a passing official, "The soul of the Republic is not measured by excess cloth, but by clean conscience." The official, clearly uninterested, responds with, "Then why is your conscience showing both knees?" and walks away. In a corner alley, you find a group of students engaged in a toga poetry battle, an ancient Roman freestyle competition, but every stanza must now mention compliance at least once. One particularly spirited bard shouts, "Let thy fold hang, like the law's decree, though chafing thighs cry mutiny," and earns raucous applause. You nod appreciatively and drop a few coins in their collection bowl. Culture lives on, even under cloth. Noontime finds you seated at a small taberna, nursing a cup of watered wine and observing the latest in toga innovation. A group of young nobles enters, each swathed in what appears to be over-dyed ceremonial, garb with dyed patterns that mimic folds, clearly fake, but visually impressive. They strut in exaggerated fashion, as if their very existence is a runway of pious performance. One of them adjusts an absurdly large shoulder loop and says, "My uncle in the Senate says it's all about the drape-to-stride ratio now. We're entering the age of performative clothiness." You sip your wine slowly. A nearby server leans in and mutters, "Last week someone spilled wine on a censor's hem. The poor boy's been spinning yarn at a punishment mill ever since." You raise your brows. "Spinning yarn for a spill?" She shrugs. "Better than flogged with a loom, which is what happened in Pompeii last year." You can't tell if she's joking. You hope she is. But then again, this is a city where toga-friendly gait analysis is now a marketable service. The early afternoon heat has you retreating to the public baths, hoping the steam will smooth the wrinkles not only in your toga, but also in your mind. The baths, ironically, have become the only space where togas are forbidden, and thus where people speak most freely. You soak beside two philosophers who debate the decree's moral impact. "It is a return to discipline," one insists. The body tempts. The toga conceals. The other snorts. The toga suffocates. "I've seen more honesty in a man's knees than in a censor's scroll." A third man, lounging nearby with cucumber slices over his eyes, adds, "It's not about virtue. It's about distraction. They want us fussing with hems while they redraw tax zones." The first philosopher grumbles, but says nothing. You tilt your head back into the warm mist and feel, for a moment, as if all this draped madness has floated away with the steam. Unfortunately, outside the baths, the fabric always waits. Re-emerging onto the streets, you are greeted by the strange sensation of wet skin meeting dry wool. You spend the next few minutes fidgeting like a novice centurion trying to rebuckle his armor. Back in the city proper, a new development causes quite the stir. A street performer has unveiled what he claims is the world's first musical toga, using tiny bronze bells sewn into the hem. It tinkles softly with each movement. Children love it. Senators less so. A magistrate storms over, declares it undignified auditory rebellion, and confiscates the garment on the spot. The crowd boos but disperses quickly. You ask the performer later whether it really played different melodies depending on the number of folds. He nods solemnly and says, "I composed a lullaby for civil harmony. Guess they didn't like the key of G." By evening, you find yourself gazing over the rooftops from a quiet perch near the Temple of Vesta. Torches flicker below like lazy fireflies. Rome breathes its nighttime sigh. And you, now draped in your evening formal compliance wrap, reflect on the sheer absurdity of this social experiment. What began as a modest decree has become a wool-clad opera in 20 acts, starring everyone and no one, directed by invisible forces and narrated by confused tailors. Yet, there's something undeniably human about it all. The desire to follow rules, the itch to resist them, the collective momentum of a city that always prefers drama in folds rather than fists. You lean back against the warm stone, close, your eyes, and imagine a future where historians will puzzle over this moment, sifting through bits of faded wool and asking, was this vanity, piety, or just a really itchy phase? You smile and whisper aloud, yes. You awaken the next morning with a sort of crick in your neck that can only be earned by sleeping half upright on a carved bench in the atrium after losing a war with your own toga. The early light filtering through the colonnade is golden and indifferent to your discomfort. As you slowly rise and readjust your sleep-wrinkled robes, you're reminded of that oddly sincere poet from the market. though chafing thighs cry mutiny. Yes, you're living that line now, in flesh and friction. After washing your face at the household basin and mumbling your usual morning ritual, which now includes a resigned groan and a whispered vow to keep your pleats symmetrical today, you step back out into the unspooling chaos of toga compliance, now escalating into something stranger and far more organized than anyone anticipated. There are signs, literal signs, posted along the forum's arcades, hastily etched with rules, diagrams, and inspirational slogans. "Dignity in drapery," reads one, beneath an ominous sketch of a toga with too few folds and a frowning censor, pointing at it like an accuser in a courtroom drama. As you make your way toward the city's civic center, you pass an alley where a group of scholars from the Athenaeum are holding a public demonstration, not against the decree, but in support of toga education. They chant in unison, "Length is virtue, crease is control," while distributing hand-drawn pamphlets with elaborate folding diagrams and citations from Stoic philosophy. "The folds," a bearded man in a heavily starched toga explains solemnly, "mirror the moral contours of the soul. Each layer hides temptation. Each seam reminds us that nothing worth doing is ever easy." You're tempted to ask if he's ever tried going upstairs in one of these things. Beside him, another academic holds a giant measuring rod and offers free moral alignment assessments based on toga length. A young boy wearing his father's oversized toga waddles up, is declared highly virtuous, and rewarded with a fig. His mother, beaming, says she'll frame the certificate. Around the corner, you enter the vicinity of the Basilica Julia, where the Senate itself is rumored to be meeting in emergency session. Word on the street is that a counter-decree may be in the works, something less itchy and more flexible, quite literally. Apparently, several senators have suffered heat rashes severe enough to seek temple-based healing rituals. One even tried invoking Asclepius by wrapping himself in medicinal herbs instead of wool, only to be escorted off the premises by a toga patrol. The Senate is now deeply divided, with one faction arguing for a return to the traditional toga praetexta, with its stately purple border, while others demand a new summer toga variant made from linen or light imported silk. Historians still argue whether these internal squabbles had more to do with political posturing or a genuine fear of wool-induced collapse. As you wait among the murmuring crowd outside the basilica steps, you overhear merchants swapping rumors with alarming specificity. Heard Senator Aelius collapsed from heat stroke mid-sentence, landed in a heap like a discarded laundry pile. "That's nothing," replies another. "Senator Rufus's toga got caught on a lectern. When he turned, the whole thing unspooled, looked like a startled snail retreating." You try not to laugh, but the mental image sticks with you. Just then, a figure rushes past carrying an enormous scroll labeled "Proposed Cloth Exemptions" by region and season. It looks heavy enough to require wheels. You glance around and notice a pop-up booth labeled "Civic Consultation Tent. Have a draping concern." You're half tempted to step inside, but a line of toga wearers, some in visible distress, stretches, well beyond what your patience can tolerate. One woman clutches her shoulder and sobs softly. "I thought I'd folded it left over right, but now I think it's right over left. And what if I'm sending the wrong message?" An attendant with tired eyes and a large abacus tries to comfort her. "Ma'am, let's just assess the hemline and breathe through it together, all right?" You retreat from the growing tension and decide to visit a friend who owns a small but clever tailoring shop just past the Theatre of Pompey. She's known for creating discreet interior pouches, stealthy understitching, and togas with airflow panels. "Innovation is my resistance," she winks when you arrive. "I've started calling them clandestige." You ask whether anyone's gotten in trouble yet for creative tailoring. She sighs. "A man came in yesterday with pleats that doubled as flute holsters. Impressive, but the censors heard the sound of music and declared it decadent. He's now weaving apology baskets in the provinces." She offers you a cup of mulled wine and shows you a prototype for a compliance-ready toga sleeping sack, designed to maintain proper alignment even in slumber. "Great for dreams of Republic-approved behavior," she jokes. You ask if it's comfortable. "Not remotely. but it respects the law. Back on the street, you wander into a religious procession devoted to Fortuna, goddess of chance, where the priests' togas are not just compliant, they're art. Embroidered symbols, dyed edges, and precision-cut layers swirl as they walk, each movement choreographed for maximum visual piety. You overhear a bystander whisper, "It's like fabric ballet," and indeed the effect is mesmerizing. But as always, the decree looms. A censor stationed at the temple gate watches with eagle-eyed scrutiny, ready to stop the ceremony if any hemline even thinks about getting cheeky. One poor initiate stumbles, and his garment slips half an inch. The censor raises a brow, but the young man corrects himself just in time, like a dancer catching a wobble. Applause breaks out, more from relief than reverence. By late afternoon, you sit beneath a shaded pergola near the Palatine Hill, catching your breath. The city hums with a strange energy, equal parts obedience and absurdity. This wasn't just about clothing anymore. You realize it's become something deeper, a citywide audition for some imaginary ideal, where every toga was a thesis and every misfold a heresy. It's exhausting, it's theatrical, it's very, very Roman. You watch a pair of boys challenge each other to a toga-tying speed contest. One wins in under 5 minutes and declares himself Emperor of Fabric. The other retaliates by designing a toga top hat and claiming the title Duke of Drape. A few onlookers applaud. You smile. Maybe rebellion doesn't need to be loud. As dusk edges closer, the light softens, and the marketplace begins its slow, fragrant decline into evening routine. You wander past stalls now half emptied of their goods, but still full of gossip. A vendor waves you over and offers a deal on plum wine. "Made by monks who fold their togas clockwise," he says proudly. You raise an eyebrow. "Tastes more pious that way." You take a sip. It tastes like fermented dignity. As night falls and torchlight returns to the streets, you glance down at your own toga and realize that, despite the day's many fold adjustments and accidental near exposures, you've somehow kept it in line with the law, if barely. You feel a strange mix of pride and exasperation. All this for cloth, for appearances, for Rome. You turn homeward, passing through alleys now thick with laughter, lute music, and the smell of roasted chestnuts. Somewhere, someone sings a song, parodying the decree to the tune of a victory march. The lyrics aren't flattering, but the crowd loves it. You pause under a carved archway and lean against the cool marble, letting the day's events swirl and settle. There's a lesson here, you think. Not one the censors intended, but one the city is learning anyway. People will always find ways to laugh in the folds, to rebel with thread, and to turn even the most restrictive rule into an opportunity for artistry or mischief. And that, perhaps, is the true fabric of Rome. The next morning, as sunlight stretches like molten gold over the terracotta roofs of Rome, you wake with a start, not because of any external alarm, but because your left arm has fallen asleep beneath the neatly arranged folds of your toga, which, in a moment of overzealous civic pride, you decided to wear to bed. Lesson learned. No matter how obedient you feel, wool is no friend to nocturnal comfort. You untangle yourself slowly, moving like a turtle emerging from its own very scratchy shell, and step into the atrium. Your sandals slap lightly on the cool tiles, and the air smells of bread baking somewhere nearby, mixed with the faint whiff of incense from a neighbor's morning offering to Vesta. It would be a peaceful scene, if not for the distant sound of some poor soul being reprimanded by a toga inspector for excessive drapery fluidity. That phrase will haunt you for the rest of the day. You decide to walk toward the market district for breakfast, hoping for a fresh honey cake and maybe a break from toga politics, but no such luck. Even the baker's stall has gotten into the act. He's selling patrician pastries, folded in half to resemble a properly layered toga pleat. "Eat with dignity," he says, handing you a fig-stuffed biscuit wrapped in a napkin embroidered with the phrase, "Modesty is delicious." You try to chuckle, but your soul is too tired. On the street ahead, a mural is being painted onto the side of a bathhouse wall. a giant toga covering the entire facade, beneath which a solemn inscription reads, Modestia Aeternum, modesty is eternal. You suspect it was commissioned by a particularly fervent senator with too much time and too many opinions. A passing child tugs at your hem and hands you a clay whistle shaped like a toga-clad owl. For good luck, she chirps before running off. You blow into it gently. It makes a sound like a surprised goose. You put it in your belt pouch, unsure if it's lucky or just weird. In the distance, a procession approaches, the weekly March for Moral Cloth. The participants shuffle slowly, dressed in identical white garments with red sashes, proclaiming their allegiance to togic purity. They chant slogans like tight cloth, loose morals, and one republic, one drape. At the head of the procession is none other than Senator Severus Pulvinus, the rumoured architect of the decree. His toga is flawless, bordered in gold thread, draped at mathematically impossible angles, and somehow simultaneously stiff and flowing. It looks less like a garment and more like an architectural statement. He speaks into a conch shell amplifier, held by an attendant. Citizens of Rome, he bellows, our attire is our virtue. When the folds are righteous, so too is the Republic. The crowd cheers, mostly because they're afraid not to. You chew your pastry slowly, hoping it doesn't count as subversion. Nearby, a group of disgruntled tailors has staged a quieter, counter-protest. They've hung tiny togas on a clothesline strung between two trees, each with messages like, hands off my hemline, and my toga, my choice. One elderly tailor is sewing pockets into sample robes while muttering, when men wore cloaks, no one cared where we put our fruit. You offer him a fig biscuit, and he gives you a grateful nod, offering in return a sample of a new invention. The toga clip. Helps prevent accidental thigh reveal, he whispers. I call it the fold lock. You promise to test it out. Historians still debate whether this device ever caught on, or if it was lost to the sands of fashion history, like the short-lived scarf of dignity era under Emperor Claudius Minor. Back in the Forum, things are escalating. A mobile tribunal has been set up by the Temple of Concordia, where citizens can file complaints about improper toga behavior. You pass a man mid-plea, insisting that his asymmetrical hemline was caused by strong winds and not by moral weakness. The judge, a magistrate in a particularly sharp toga, nods gravely and asks, "Did you offer the wind a sacrifice before dressing?" You don't stay to hear the answer. Instead, you duck into a nearby barbershop where the patrons are, predictably, discussing the latest scandal. A famed orator accused of bribing his toga adjusters. 2 denarii per pleat, whispers one. Outrageous. The barber nods. It's the new corruption. Bribery of the cloth. Where does it end? You sip watered wine and listen as another patron, clearly a philosopher of the Stoic persuasion, argues that all this fuss over fabric is the natural end of a society. Too obsessed with appearances. When we care more about a man's hem than his heart, we are already lost. Someone counters with, "Yes, but do you want to see Consul Balbus in a short tunic again? That was traumatizing." The room shudders in agreement. You realize the problem isn't just about togas. It's about fear. Fear of disorder, of decay, of unexpected needs. And in that fear, the toga has become both symbol and scapegoat. Later, you visit the Temple of Minerva for a bit of quiet reflection and perhaps some divine wisdom on wardrobe management. Inside, the High Priestess wears a toga variant woven with images of owls and scrolls. She tells you that several religious orders have begun designing ceremonial togas with symbolic stitching meant to communicate specific virtues: piety, chastity, civic responsibility. It's like a resume you wear, she explains, only more breathable. You nod politely, though your own toga now feels less like clothing and more like a mildly vengeful pet trying to escape your body. She offers you a saffron-scented oil said to reduce static. You apply it and immediately smell like a sacred salad. As dusk paints the city in soft oranges and purples, you walk past a gathering at a public square where amateur performers are staging a toga-themed comedy. It's a light-hearted satire titled "The Fold That Broke the Censor's Back." One actor's toga unravels dramatically every time he tells a lie. The crowd roars with laughter. Even a passing censor cracks a smile before quickly straightening his expression and scribbling a warning. You find a stone bench and sit quietly, taking in the view. Rome continues to live and breathe beneath the weight of its own self-image, and the togas, once mere garments, now speak louder than any oration. They declare, silently but sternly, "I belong, I conform, I suffer." As night rises, you return home, slip out of the toga with a groan of relief, and hang it carefully on its designated hook. You rub your shoulder, where the clip pressed all day, and wonder if this madness will pass, if fabric will ever stop being a battleground. But then again, this is Rome. Even our footwear once sparked a Senate debate. You lie down, blanket drawn, wool-free at last, and let the soft murmur of distant flute music lull you towards sleep. Hoping tomorrow brings less folding and more sense. You wake to the sound of bees, not the aggressive buzzing panic of a swarm, but the steady, almost rhythmic hum of a beekeeper's cart rolling down the alley below your window, its woven baskets wriggling faintly with their precious cargo. It's oddly soothing, in a Roman sort of way. You stretch beneath your wool-free blanket and wonder whether today will bring freedom from toga tyranny. Spoiler, it won't. You already hear your neighbor cursing under his breath about something being too symmetrical. You get up, adjust your hair with a bit of leftover olive oil, and eye your wardrobe like it's a lineup of suspects. 3 togas, each draped slightly differently. One conservative, one performatively humble, and one just flamboyant enough to get you in trouble. You pick the middle one and spend the next 10 minutes adjusting the folds with all the precision of a military engineer building a siege ladder. There are entire treatises written on this stuff. You're not taking chances. Stepping into the street, you find that yet another decree has gone up overnight. This one is etched into a bronze plaque on a marble pedestal. It's the Toga Conduct Edict, Addendum 4. According to this, citizens are now encouraged to wear emotionally neutral fabric colours. Bright crimson and royal purple are still reserved for senators and emperors, of course. But now even pale sky blue has been deemed too celebratory for public wear. You pass a vendor angrily dyeing his leftover sky blue bolts of cloth with crushed walnut shells to create an acceptable pious beige. You keep your gaze downward as you walk, hoping your sandals aren't too shiny. Historians still debate whether this moment marked the beginning of Rome's infamous beige years, a period of subdued tones, suppressed flair, and widespread quiet. Resentment. By midday, the sun is hot enough to turn stone to stew, and the forum's central fountain is occupied by a gaggle of young philosophers arguing over whether a toga that causes you to sweat excessively can be considered immoral. The body, one declares, is a temple. If the drapery encourages mildew, are we not defiling it? A second insists, no, it's the effort to appear too clean that implies vanity, which is the root of corruption. You sip watered wine, in the shade, watching their togas stick to their backs in the heat, slowly losing shape and, by imperial standards, integrity. One of them faints dramatically. The others nod solemnly, as though martyrdom by wool were an acceptable scholarly sacrifice. You continue to the Census Bureau, where you're supposed to report for your 5-year citizenship update. Inside, the line stretches out the door. A clerk is measuring everyone's toga hemmed to check conformity with decorum-length guidelines. Yours is technically within limits, but the official gives you a disapproving look and marks a small note. On your parchment anyway. Probably something like borderline breezy. Next to you, a young man is scolded for wearing sandals with decorative straps. Indulgent, the clerk mutters. The Republic needs strong ankles and stronger restraint. You suppress the urge to point out that his left ankle is visibly swollen. That kind of empathy might earn you a full toga audit. Later, you make your way to the Subura district. where life tends to move at a more forgiving pace. Here, the rules are applied a bit more loosely. Street performers in slightly too short tunics mingle with vendors selling fabric offcuts from last year's fashion wave. One elderly woman hawks lavender-scented pins with slogans like "Fold," "Freedom Now," and "Unbind the Republic." You buy one discreetly and pin it inside your toga, where it presses warmly against your chest like a tiny act of revolution. You pass a baker's stall where miniature togas are being wrapped around, meat pies. "Dress your dinner in dignity," the sign reads. It's hard to tell whether it's satire anymore. Rome has a habit of parodying itself so effectively that even the jokes start filing paperwork. You find a quiet square where a puppet show is underway. The marionettes are tiny senators arguing over a toga draft law. One keeps tripping over his own hem, while the other insists on measuring it with a comically long stick. The children laugh, the adults smirk, and a single magistrate takes notes ominously in the corner. "Subversive undertones," you overhear him mutter. Too much. Slapstick. You turn away and walk slowly toward the baths of Titus, hoping a long soak might restore your faith in public decency, or at least cool your armpits. Inside the bath complex, the warm air smells of mint and cedar. You ease into the caldarium, the hot room, and immediately feel your shoulders relax. Around you, men are quietly comparing notes on toga folding techniques. "I heard the emperor's valet uses a bronze comb to lift the folds," one whispers. "More air circulation." Another claims that rubbing lemon balm oil on the skin before dressing creates a sort of anti-cling buffer. Takes the static. "Out of civic duty," he says. You close your eyes and float a little. This is the closest you've come to forgetting about the decree, until someone brings up the rumor that the emperor's next law will include required toga inspections at city gates. That jolts you upright, spraying warm water into the lap of a nearby senator, who merely sighs and says, "We used to bathe in peace." That evening, you're invited to a dinner hosted by a wealthy merchant, known for hosting mildly scandalous theme nights. Tonight's theme: Togas of the Provinces. Guests are encouraged to wear non-standard interpretations of the traditional garment. Some show up in silk-draped versions influenced by Egyptian Calaseries styles. Others opt for brightly dyed Iberian adaptations with bold embroidery. It's a visual riot. You wear a Gallic-inspired toga woven with tiny green ivy leaves and immediately receive both compliments and subtle glares. Halfway through the meal, a courier arrives breathless, bearing a scroll from the Office of Garment Consistency. The host reads it aloud. "Let it be known that variations on the traditional toga are to be permitted only during Saturnalia or sanctioned civic festivals. Non-conformist gatherings will be monitored for moral deviation." A few guests nervously adjust their tunics. One quietly swaps into an emergency white robe from beneath the table. The party continues, but the wine flows a little less freely. As you walk home beneath a velvet sky pricked with stars, you spot the silhouette of the Capitoline Hill rising against the moonlight. Somewhere up there, in a columned chamber lit with braziers and ambition, the Senate is probably still debating whether short capes count as togas or mere accessories. You pull your cloak a little tighter and exhale slowly. Rome is still Rome. Brilliant, ridiculous, eternal. And you're a citizen caught in the crossfolds of history. Tomorrow will bring more regulations, more fashion patrols, more whispered rebellions stitched into inner hems. But tonight, at least, the city sleeps. And in the quiet hush of darkened streets, your steps echo gently as you return to your modest domus. Unclip your secret pin and hang your toga like a worn flag after battle. You wake again to another Roman morning, the city already stirring with the symphony of sandals clacking on stone and bronze bells chiming from passing bread carts. There's a light dew on the window ledge of your domus and a breeze just faint, enough to ruffle the edge of your toga, which, thankfully, has not yet been outlawed in its overnight hanging position. You've begun to realize that in this version of Rome, simply getting dressed might soon require a legal advisor. The new decree that arrived late yesterday evening, hand-delivered on wax-sealed scrolls to every household, courtesy of the Emperor's Fabric Enforcement Committee, clarifies that excessively crisp pleats may suggest arrogance and must be gently rumpled to imply humility. It's the sort of regulation that raises more questions than it answers. What defines excessive? How does one engineer the correct level of rumple? Is there a designated humble pleat inspector? You contemplate pinching your shoulder fold slightly and decide it's still too early in the day for that kind of emotional risk. Outside, the city glows in soft gold. You pass a group of workers patching up a public notice wall, scraping off outdated posters and layering on the latest edicts. One flyer features a diagram of toga layers with labelled zones of potential misinterpretation. The nape area is tagged conspicuous if raised, while the lower hem is distracting if asymmetrical. A passing child points at the poster and asks his mother, "Why do grown-ups wear blankets with rules?" The mother replies without looking up, "Because Rome has too many senators and not enough tailors." Historians still argue whether the increasing micromanagement of civic dress was an early symptom of imperial overreach or merely a reflection of Roman society's obsession with performative propriety. Your destination this morning is the Temple of Concord, where a public symposium is being held. The topic? The moral fibre of fabrics. Inside the marble-columned hall, citizens sit on rows of stone benches, whispering about last week's incident, where a local judge invalidated a legal contract because the accused wore a tunic beneath his toga. Duplicitous layering, the court declared. The symposium begins with a priest from the Vestal College delivering a long, slow homily about how drapery mirrors the soul. A clean fold reflects a clean conscience, a loose sash, a loose sense of duty. Then a textile merchant from Ostia stands to argue that wool shortages, not vanity, are responsible for toga shrinkage. He presents dyed samples, charts of sheep populations, and a small puppet goat named Varus to make his point. The audience nods politely. Varus bleats once, and a magistrate records the puppet's testimony with a straight face. Afterward, you wander the streets, observing how different classes are coping. Senators glide by in togas so heavily draped, they resemble moving libraries. You spot a group of urban slaves awkwardly adjusting their master's folds from behind like stagehands repositioning backdrops. One young aristocrat, clearly pushing his luck, wears a toga embedded with tiny embroidered quotes from Cicero. A street vendor eyes him and mutters, "Too clever by half. He'll get cited before dinner." In the alleyways, meanwhile, you find evidence of quiet protest. A hidden stall sells reversible togas, pure white on one side for inspections, and vivid saffron on the other for private gatherings. There's also a scroll rental booth offering borrowed modesty, pre-approved, language to accompany slightly non-compliant attire. One popular phrase, "Forgive this fold, it serves no pride." Another, "The breeze, not the ego, made this hem stray." You duck into a shadowed arcade to avoid a toga checkpoint. The guards are well-meaning, but increasingly eager, equipped, with folding sticks to measure hem length and scent sachets to detect unauthorized perfumes. "That smells like clove," one barks at a trembling citizen. "Only lemon balm is sanctioned for civic engagement." You shuffle past unnoticed, thanks to your emotionally neutral cologne, a faint whiff of damp marble. Across the square, a man dressed entirely in scrolls is protesting the restrictions by turning legal jargon into literal fashion. He twirls slowly while reading from his left sleeve. Section 12, Clause B. Pleats may not imply aspiration. A small crowd claps. One child offers him a flower. A toga inspector approaches, hesitates, then walks away, muttering, "Symbolic immunity. Clever." By midday, the sun hammers the rooftops and everyone moves slower. You enter a shaded taberna for a bite and some relief. The interior is filled with patrons half unwrapped, their togas sagging like weary sails. There's laughter here, loud, irreverent, and vaguely treasonous. A grizzled poet performs an impromptu recitation titled Ode to the Itchy Seam. His voice rises. If dignity be woven, must I suffer for every thread? The audience roars with sleepy approval. Behind the counter, the cook serves a dish called garum roasted modesty. It's just salted fish on plain bread, wrapped in parchment inscribed with former fashion edicts. You chew thoughtfully, imagining future archaeologists trying to piece together the psychology of a civilization that regulated both social climbing and shoulder draping with equal fervor. In the afternoon, you visit your cousin, a newly appointed municipal tailor. He greets you with a look of weary panic. Do you know how many fabric codes exist now? He asks. 14. He waves a hand toward a loom still warm from the morning's labor. They've started inspecting thread origin. If it wasn't sheared north of the Tiber, it's deemed culturally inconsistent. I just lost a client because my sheep graze in the wrong zip code. He collapses onto a stool, robe askew, a stack of rejected togas beside him. One is covered in tiny stars. Astro-elitist, it was called. Another features a subtle vine motif. Suggests leisure. You help him re-roll a bolt of cloth and ask if he's ever considered opening a shop in Gaul. I hear they're experimenting with pants, you joke. He doesn't laugh. He just shudders. Evening falls gently, and Rome softens under twilight. The statues lining the Avenue of Triumph seem to lean in toward you as you pass, their robes chiseled in idealistic folds that would never survive a real breeze. You pause before one, perhaps a forgotten general, and imagine his stone toga cracking in protest. Even I, he might whisper, would have chosen comfort over conformity. You head home beneath the hush of curfew bells. On your way, a street bard sings a parody of imperial decrees in a minor key. His lyrics include, "If your elbow shows, the empire knows," and "No thigh shall see the city light, lest virtue tremble in its flight." You toss him a coin and wonder if satire might be the last thread left unregulated. Back in your quiet courtyard, you unpin your sash, slip off your carefully rumpled robe, and fold it with exaggerated reverence, as if, tucking in a child, tomorrow may bring more mandates, more fabric philosophy, more toga-related arrests. But for tonight, you light a single oil lamp, take a deep breath of linen and lamp smoke, and let the weight of Rome slip from your shoulders. Somewhere outside, the wind rustles a loose decree hanging from a public notice board. It flaps gently in the breeze, unfolded, unpunished, free. You rise to find the city drenched in a golden haze, the kind of late-morning sunlight that makes every marble column gleam like it's had a good night's rest, which is more than can be said for the citizens still puzzling over yesterday's update to the Imperial Toga Code. Apparently, new criteria have been added under something called behavioral drapery indicators. It's now not just about what you wear, but how you behave while wearing it. Slouching in your toga is considered defensive posture, while leaning jauntily to one side suggests aspirational overconfidence. If you fidget with your hemline too much, you're trying to distract from philosophical ignorance. You make a mental note to practice the appropriate neutral toga stance. Arms modestly tucked, back neither too straight nor too relaxed, head inclined at exactly the angle of respectful boredom. Historians still argue whether this was part of a wider imperial attempt to choreograph an entire citizenry, or simply the emperor's misguided passion project after a disappointing poetry class. Today, you're due at the Rhetorical Assembly, a sort of public speaking salon held in the open forum, where participants must now deliver orations while meeting the new drapery compliance guidelines. Orators have taken to pinning small wax seals onto their folds, each stamped with tiny phrases like state-approved sincerity or emotionally disciplined. Some of the more rebellious types arrive with subtly mocking alternatives. One young student wears a seal reading "Wrinkle of Truth." Another pins his hem with "This fold has opinions." The audience stifles giggles, and the toga monitors, increasingly exhausted, pretend not to notice. You pick a seat among the statues near the fountain, just far enough back to feign reverence, but close enough to hear the gossip. The first speaker is a grain merchant from the Aventine Hill who attempts to argue that the emperor's clothing reforms have revitalized the struggling sheep industry. His logic spirals into wool metaphors. As the fleece is sheared for clarity, so too must our pride be trimmed. He gestures dramatically, causing his sash to swing a bit too enthusiastically. A toga monitor coughs disapprovingly. The next speaker is an elderly widow who reads from a parchment containing what she calls the Forgotten Folds. It's a collection of outdated toga styles, short-lived experiments with shoulder capes, pleated hoods, and, briefly, ornamental fringe. She holds up a drawing of a toga with built-in storage pockets. "I used to keep my garlic in this one," she says fondly. The crowd chuckles. A child sitting near you whispers, "Is that legal?" And their father replies, "Only if it's metaphorical garlic now." The discussion shifts to enforcement. A bureaucrat, red-cheeked and already sweating through his linen, explains that toga citations have increased by 240% in the last week, resulting in a bottleneck at the city's fabric arbitration office. Cases include a librarian whose toga was deemed too intellectual, a baker accused of dough-related drapery slackness, and a senator fined for what was described as swagger-induced sash drift. This last charge causes an outburst of laughter from the crowd, and the bureaucrat awkwardly mutters that enforcement is still refining its lexicon. You remember your neighbor, a soft-spoken mosaic artist who had once been stopped and asked if her toga's dusty hem indicated proletarian rebellion. She simply said, "No, I dropped my lunch." The guard wrote her up anyway. After the assembly, you detour to the Subura district, Rome's messier, livelier underside, to check in on your tailor cousin again. His workshop is in shambles. A small line of customers, scribes, minor officials, even a gladiator, waits in sweaty silence, holding half-finished robes and grim expressions. Your cousin greets you with a sigh. "You remember that wool batch I ordered? Delayed. Apparently it didn't pass the moral purity test." You ask if that's a joke. He doesn't laugh. "No, it's a real thing now. They're testing sheep feed for philosophical contamination. Too much Epicureanism in the barley, apparently." Behind him, his apprentice tries to calm a toga-wearing mannequin that's begun to tilt ominously due to overlayering. A sign above the doorway now reads, "The Compliant Seam, Sartorial Peace of Mind." To lift your cousin's spirits, you take him to the baths of Caracalla. It's one of the few places where people can still relax their robes without fear of immediate reprimand. You step into the tepidarium, and the steam wraps around you like a forgiving toga of its own. Men and women recline on marble benches, discussing everything from military taxes to toga fabric softeners. One woman claims she's developed a washable wool blend by mixing sheep fleece with fig bark. "Soft as philosophy," she says, "but smells like ambition." Another bather mutters that the emperor himself wears imported silk under his tunic. The claim is met with scandalized gasps and a chorus of "historians still debate that," which has become the city's default defense against all hearsay. Later, in the frigidarium, a young scribe tells you about his friend, a philosopher in training, who has started teaching underground classes in drapery neutrality. They meet in abandoned libraries and study ancient texts on Stoic tailoring. The goal, he explains solemnly, is to achieve perfect emotional symmetry in your robe. Neither proud nor ashamed, just folded. You agree to attend the next session. Curiosity, after all, is one of the few things not yet regulated. Back on the streets, dusk paints everything in warm rose light. You stop by a candle stall, where the waxmaker has begun carving tiny togas onto his tapers. "Burning down the empire, one fold at a time," he says with a wink. As you head home, you notice that people have begun exchanging subtle signals with their sashes. A twist to the left indicates satirical intent. A knot to the right suggests ironic compliance. The city has invented a new language in folds and drapes, It's becoming harder for the toga inspectors to keep up. When you arrive at your domus, you find a new decree pinned to your door. It's printed on parchment that smells faintly of olive oil and carries the imperial seal. It reads, "Effective immediately, all citizens must ensure their togas display neither upward ambition nor downward despair. Drapery must symbolize civic harmony." You stare at the sentence for a long moment, imagining toga-shaped mood rings, hemline lie detectors, robes that chirp when you're too smug. You crumple the decree into a soft ball, set it beside a bowl of figs, and head for the roof. Up above the city, the stars blink into place one by one. Below, Rome murmurs and settles into its nightly sigh. A breeze flutters across the rooftops, lifting laundry and parchments alike. You imagine all the citizens curling up, rolling their sashes into sleep masks, dreaming of a world where their clothing isn't critiqued by philosophy students with rulers. You lie back on the stone tiles, gaze at the sky and whisper a simple hope. May tomorrow's folds be merciful. The next morning greets you with the unmistakable rustle of papyrus and the slightly more ominous clatter of sandals on mosaic tile. A courier, fresh-faced and over-caffeinated, stands at your door holding yet another rolled decree, tied with an absurdly elaborate bow. "New category of sartorial infractions," he says, clearly proud to be part of Rome's most booming industry. "Scroll delivery. This one's about emotive silhouettes." You blink. It means your toga can't suggest moods, no heroic flares, no melancholic sag. You thank him, take the scroll, and try not to slam the door too hard. As you unroll it, the parchment gives off a faint whiff of lavender and regulation. It lists emotional expressions now banned by toga configuration: triumphal uplift, romantic tilt, defiant crease, and, most baffling of all, wistful shoulder droop. You pinch the bridge of your nose. Somewhere, toga philosophers are weeping into symmetrical napkins. With the city in an anxious stir over this latest development, you make your way to the local laundrine, Rome's public laundromats, where cleaners, tailors, and their increasingly sarcastic customers have gathered for an impromptu town meeting. It takes place among giant vats of urine used for bleaching cloth. A detail you try not to focus on as a man in a wine-stained toga rants, "I got fined for suggestive hemlines." I wasn't even trying to suggest anything. I was climbing stairs. Another woman, her sash tied in a precarious figure eight, mutters that her neighbor was cited for melancholy drapery tension while mourning her husband. It was a funeral. What did they want? Festive ruffles. A murmur of agreement passes through the crowd. One laundress points out that everyone's robes are now so fearfully neutral, it's becoming impossible to tell if someone is celebrating a birthday or being exiled. One enterprising young dyer suggests a solution: a discrete code of pigments. "Let's dye togas with invisible ink, lemon juice and sun heat. That way, under direct sunlight, a secret phrase appears." She holds up a sample, a soft ivory toga that, when warmed, reveals the words "still folding." Another reads, "Don't look too closely." The crowd applauds in gentle delight. You offer a suggestion of your own. "Could we just switch to tunics?" Gasps erupt. "That's barbarian talk," someone whispers. "Tunics are for Gallic dentists." You're not sure what that means, but you nod in apology. From there, you drift into the marketplace. Fruit sellers have begun stacking their wares into pyramid-like towers, shaped vaguely like togas. Grapes wrapped in fig leaves, pears draped in cabbage. Softer than wool, sweeter than the emperor's moods, boasts one vendor. Children dart between stalls, their togas flapping like little rebellious banners. An elderly woman stops to repin her sash with a small bronze brooch shaped like a shrug. "I used to wear armor," she tells you. "Now I'm worried my sleeve is too conceptual." You pause near the statue of Cincinnatus, once the model. Roman farmer turned reluctant dictator, now draped in what can only be described as a civic compliance cloak, newly commissioned by decree. At his feet, a young boy has sketched cartoons of toga inspectors in the dust, one shaped like a sandal, another with eyes the size of olives. A passing senator frowns but says nothing. Even the Senate is struggling. Word has it that yesterday's debate over canal funding was derailed when two senators got into a heated argument about a third's aggressively pleated forearm. Meanwhile, performance artists have found a loophole. Street mimes have begun reenacting the history of Roman drapery without ever touching fabric. One stands perfectly still, hands poised as if adjusting a sash that isn't there. His face is painted white, his eyes fixed on the horizon. A plaque at his feet reads, "Toga of the Mind." The crowd is mesmerized. A toga inspector walks by, squints, opens his mouth to issue a citation, then quietly walks away. You find yourself genuinely moved. Later, someone puts a fig in the mime's cup. By midday, rumors swirl that an underground fashion salon has formed near the old aqueduct ruins. You follow the whispered directions through alleyways that smell of cumin and old clay, past an abandoned grain store, down a narrow staircase beneath a crumbling arch. There, illuminated by flickering oil lamps, is a hidden room filled with tailors, artists, and what appears to be a disillusioned philosopher named Crispus. "Welcome to the Fold Underground," he says solemnly. "We believe in the radical idea that a robe can express both civic pride and personal tragedy." Around him, mannequins are dressed in togas bearing embroidered marginalia, constellations, river maps, poems stitched along the hem. One robe features a constellation pattern that shifts depending on how it's folded. Another has a sash that whispers tiny proverbs when unrolled. You sit on a stone bench, sipping spiced wine from a chipped goblet, and listen to Crispus describe his newest design, the reconciliation wrap, a robe meant to evoke both modesty and philosophical depth. When folded this way, he explains, it suggests a willingness to compromise. Folded the other way, it simply says, "I was cold." The group laughs softly. Someone offers you a stylus and a piece of linen. Sketch what you'd wear if the rules didn't exist. You draw something ridiculous, half toga, half tunic, with a built-in snack pouch and adjustable neckline for naps. They love it. A tailor leans in. "We'll make it, but only for nighttime wear." When you finally emerge from the Fold Underground, dusk is descending and the city seems quieter, like a stage resetting for the next act. You pass a couple sitting by a public fountain, feeding each other olives, their togas touching just slightly at the edges. A street musician plays a gentle tune on a lyre, and for a moment, the folds of everyone's garments flutter in rhythm. You begin to wonder, has all this drapery obsession made the city more attuned to movement, to posture, to the subtle language of fabric? Is this madness secretly elegance? Historians still argue whether these reforms refined Roman aesthetics or just gave anxious people something new to worry about. At home, you peel off your robe like a second skin, hang it carefully on its peg, and lie on your couch beneath the open sky. The breeze dances through the fig trees. You imagine the emperor poring over parchment, earnestly sketching new guidelines by candlelight, whispering to himself, "Yes, but what if the fold yearns too much?" Somewhere nearby, a neighbor hums softly while brushing lint from their sash. You close your eyes and think, maybe one day the fabric will speak for itself. You wake to bird song and a glint of morning light filtering through the linen curtains. Somewhere in the distance, a toga inspector is already knocking on someone else's door. Poor soul. You stretch, your shoulders stiff from dreams filled with abstract folds and judgmental senators. Today's plan is to lie low, perhaps blend in by adopting the new, officially sanctioned neutral posture, which involves standing with arms folded at the correct angle of 17 degrees and a facial expression that suggests neither pride nor regret. The pose was introduced yesterday in an emergency decree titled Legislative Harmonization of Draped Appearances, though most Romans have started calling it the shrug of duty. You practice it in the mirror. It's not flattering, but it'll do. Breakfast is a modest affair. Flatbread, goat cheese, and a few figs you stole from the neighbor's tree under the cover of pre-dawn gloom. Nobody saw, or if they did, they assumed you were rearranging your toga and gave you privacy. Later, you stroll past the baths, where a small crowd has gathered to read the latest bulletin posted by the Office of Civic Attire. The headline reads, "Emergency, moratorium on cinched waists." A groan rises from the bathers. One shouts, "It's summer. We're all trying to look breezy, not imperial." Another adds, "My uncle got arrested yesterday for hostile belt energy." You nod sympathetically and keep walking. Next up is the forum, where Rome's merchants, orators, and philosophers meet to engage in robust civic discourse, or just loudly judge each other's sandals. As you arrive, a group of middle-aged politicians are attempting to debate tax reform while avoiding eye contact with each other's torsos. One, dressed in a billowy affair that could double as a sail, is lecturing on virtue while his hem tangles in a passing cart. "The drapery of the state must remain unprovocative," he bellows even as a cabbage rolls by unnoticed. Another senator whispers to you, "Between us, I miss the armor days." At least when someone disliked your policy, they threw a spear, not a sewing needle. But there's an undercurrent of rebellion in the air. You notice small symbols beginning to appear again. Hidden motifs stitched into hems, sandals with soles carved to leave messages in the dust. A child skips by, leaving behind footprints that spell, "Unfold me." Even the pigeons seem to be nesting only on statues draped in especially rebellious folds. Historians still debate whether this moment marked the true beginning of Rome's passive aesthetic resistance, or if it was simply the population's way of saying, "We're bored, let's embroider something sarcastic." You duck into the Temple of Concord, a sanctuary of unity and carefully pressed robes. Inside, a group of Vestal virgins are quietly adjusting each other's garments with sacred precision. One of them, barely out of adolescence, glances at your sash and says, "That pleat is dangerously interpretive." You freeze. Another Vestal softens the blow. "Don't worry, we've started a handbook." She shows you a neatly illustrated scroll titled "Folds That Soothe, a Vestal Guide to Acceptable Drapery." It includes diagrams with labels like Penitent Cascade, Contented Drape, and the Unbothered Spiral. You are taught a few of these sacred configurations. It's surprisingly calming, almost like origami, but with stakes involving civic order and possible exile. As the day stretches on, the sun climbs higher, casting long shadows across the paving stones. At the market, fabric merchants now offer emotionless wool in 12 shades of regulated beige. One stall boasts, guaranteed to elicit no response from any bureaucrat. The vendor wraps a swatch around your shoulders and nods. Now you look like a man who neither seeks attention nor avoids it. Perfect. Just then, a commotion draws your eye. Two toga inspectors have cornered a teenage girl whose robe has frayed at the hem into what could be mistaken for artistic fringe. "Unlawful movement in the lower quadrant," one mutters. But before they can issue a fine, a group of elderly women surrounds the girl and begins loudly complaining about the inspector's shoes. "Too polished. What are you hiding?" "Yes, what kind of citizen maintains that much heel symmetry?" The distraction works. The girl slips away. The women cackle and vanish into the olive press. You make a mental note. Senior citizens are Rome's most effective guerrilla force. You seek refuge in a shaded tavern where a stoic named Lucullus is sipping watered wine and sketching toga patterns onto papyrus. "You ever notice," he says, without looking up, "how the emperor's decrees are becoming more poetic? Yesterday's addendum ended with the line, 'Let no fold flirt with the future.' You ask him what he thinks it means. He shrugs, takes a sip, and replies, 'I think he's lonely.'" The tavern crowd is hushed, half listening. Someone adds, "Maybe we're all lonely, but at least we're nicely draped." Laughter ripples through the room. You glance around and realize that everyone's robes are slightly out of regulation. One man has a folded napkin sewn into his collar. A woman wears her sash in the exact shape of a duck, and someone's tunic has discreetly shimmering thread. It's not quite rebellion, It's something softer, a kind of slow burn insubordination, like a bedtime story told under imperial sheets. You return home that night and find a tiny letter tucked under your door. It's from Crispus, the underground philosopher tailor. It reads, "New design complete. We call it the Forget-Me-Not, to be worn only during dreams." You smile and look up at the stars. Somewhere out there, a tailor is stitching joy into folds no sensor can flatten. And maybe, just maybe, one day soon, your robe will dance again. Dawn arrives gently, with a cool breeze that stirs the pale folds of your curtain and makes the olive branches outside rustle like gossip. You rise slowly, moving through the morning like someone carefully avoiding the suspicious gaze of a toga inspector, which, come to think of it, you probably are. Your breakfast is plain but comforting, a bowl of barley porridge with a drizzle of honey and a small side of olives. As you chew, you remember the old days, just a few months ago really, when the biggest controversy in the city was whether the fish sauce market was being monopolized by that shady family from the Aventine. Now the controversy is whether your left pleat indicates sedition. You finish your meal and step outside. The street is quiet but watchful. Everyone moves a little slower these days, like their togas are weighted with suspicion. You pass a woman who's invented a clever trick. She wears an overskirt of completely legal beige, but underneath, flashes of scarlet peek out when she turns too quickly. She catches your eye, smiles knowingly, and disappears into the bakery. Down at the public square, a gathering is forming. Not a riot. Those are too loud and involve too many abrupt movements. But something softer. A drapery sit-in. As it's become known, dozens of citizens have quietly assembled, each seated in a position that shows off their folds in subtle defiance. One man's cloak swirls like ocean waves. Another has turned his toga into a subtle geometric map of the empire. No slogans, no chants, just the language of linen and wool. A boy walks by selling miniature clay figurines of illegal toga configurations. You buy one shaped like the rebellious fanfold. It's adorable and treasonous. A passing magistrate gives you a glance that says, "I saw nothing," and moves on. The mood is almost festive. Someone strums a lyre in a minor key, while others sip watered wine and pretend it's simply a knitting circle. But even this quiet defiance makes the city guards nervous. By midday, a squad arrives to disperse the sit-in. Their approach is slow, deliberate, and thoroughly apologetic. They've been trained to avoid eye contact with potentially expressive pleats. One guard even drops his helmet and takes a seat, quietly adjusting his sash into what might be a dove. Later, you find yourself at the baths of Caracalla, hoping to soak the tension out of your limbs and maybe eavesdrop on the latest philosophical justifications for slightly slanted hemlines. In the steam room, the air is thick with citrus and rebellion. Two older men debate whether diagonal stitching constitutes emotional bias in attire. A young woman interjects, pointing out that the emperor's favourite statue, his marble likeness in the forum, features a toga that would now be banned. Historians still argue, she says, adjusting her towel artfully, whether that was an early symbol of hypocrisy or just bad sculpting technique. One of the men snorts. Or maybe the emperor just wanted to show a little leg. Everyone laughs, and the steam thickens like a curtain falling over the conversation. In the dressing chamber, you overhear a whispered plan. Apparently a group of tailors, tired of the restrictions and creative bottlenecks, are planning an exhibition in the catacombs. A secret gallery of outlawed toga designs, modelled by brave volunteers and lit with stolen temple lanterns. It's absurd, dangerous, and precisely what Rome needs right now. You're handed a token, a small ivory button with a spiral etched into it. It's your invitation. Later that evening, under the guise of visiting a sick aunt who exists only in theory, you find yourself at a discreet side entrance to the catacombs. A man in a cloak nods at your button and lets you in. The air inside is musty, cool, and humming with quiet excitement. Dozens of people are gathered in the torchlight, their shadows dancing on the ancient walls. And then the show begins. One by one, models emerge from a passageway wearing creations that would make the emperor's blood pressure spike like a cheap sundial in July. There's the swan spiral, a toga that unfurls like a bird taking flight. The apologetic bloom, a robe so delicately layered it seems to wilt modestly in the light. And the eternal shrug, a minimalist masterpiece that somehow says, "I'm innocent, and I dare you," at the same time. The crowd watches in hushed awe, their applause silent but electric. You feel a rush of pride, like you're witnessing a moment that will never be inscribed in marble, but will live forever in soft wool and whispered memories. As the final model walks past, her robe stitched with tiny silver stars that shimmer, in the torchlight, someone beside you says, "It's not about clothing. It never was." You nod. It's about the folds between conformity and expression, between obedience and personality. It's about the way a civilization wraps itself, not just in laws, but in stories told through texture and tilt. When the show ends, there's no riot, no anthem, just quiet nods, gentle hugs, and people helping each other fold their cloaks correctly before returning to the surface world. Back above ground, you walk slowly, every step feeling like part of a greater choreography. You pass a wall freshly marked with chalk, a single swirl, and the word unravel. A soft smile creeps across your face. You make it home, just as the moon begins to rise, its pale light casting soft shadows on the floor, like the brushstrokes of a lazy artist. You hang up your robe with reverence, letting it drape over the hook, like it's exhaling after a long day. Then you slip into your dreams, which tonight are stitched in wool, dyed in secret hues, and full of whispers that fold time itself. The next morning, you awaken with a faint scent of lavender still clinging to your hair, a gift from the catacombs, where someone had discreetly hung bundles of herbs near the hidden torch brackets, to keep the air feeling less like crypt and more like clandestine spa. Your feet are still sore from standing so long, but your mind hums like a lyre string. Rome feels different today. You notice it immediately when you open your shutters. A tailor's apprentice skipping down the street, wearing what appears to be an intentionally oversized sash knotted in the shape of a fig leaf. Two elderly neighbors drinking watered wine on their stoop, while one subtly fans herself with a folded bolt of contraband crimson linen. And a stray dog wearing what might technically qualify as a toga sleeve. You don't know who started the trend of toga-based pet fashion, but you hope they're getting enough sleep, and perhaps some funding. As you sip your morning brew, steeped fig leaves, a pinch of rosemary, and a hint of fermented date, you hear the distant sound of public decree horns. Not urgent, not ominous, but that sort of ceremonial fanfare that suggests another imperial update, probably read by some underpaid herald on the Senate steps. By midday, a modest crowd gathers at the Forum, fanning themselves and gossiping with that special Roman blend of disinterest and inner fire. The herald steps forward with all the dramatic gravitas of someone forced to read a scroll he clearly disagrees with. By decree of the emperor, he begins, there shall be a temporary suspension of garment inspections, pending the establishment of an official council of decorative moderation. The crowd collectively squints. In short, the herald mutters, the toga patrols are being put on hold while the Senate debates which folds are actually dangerous. The mood shifts immediately. A spontaneous burst of applause breaks out, quiet, polite, but sincere. Someone shouts, "So I can wear my cousin's birthday toga again." Another yells, "Long live decorative moderation." It's unclear whether this is sarcasm, but it's definitely Rome. You walk through the marketplace, now a slow-moving tapestry of cautious experimentation. Fabric merchants unroll bolts they'd kept hidden for weeks. One boasts a shocking teal weave imported from a coastal Gallic settlement, claiming it was once banned for causing vertigo in senators. Another vendor sells brooches shaped like mini thunderbolts with the tagline, "Fasten with fury, but legally." You stop at a bakery you haven't visited in a while, mainly because their scones were rumoured to be shaped like imperial busts, which was briefly outlawed under a clause about edible disrespect. But now, business is booming. The baker proudly hands you a bun glazed to look like the emperor's haircut. Crispy on the outside, she says, and full of hot air. You nearly choke on a laugh. She winks. I'll deny it if asked. The rebellion has turned inward now, diffused through jokes, pastries, and subtle threads of protest sewn into everyday life. At the Temple of Vesta, the Vestal virgins have taken up embroidery again. They claim it's for ceremonial robes, but you hear whispers that they're quietly stitching a full-length narrative of the toga ban in pictogram form. Tiny thread soldiers chasing even tinier toga wearers around the hem of a sacred garment. You imagine a future archaeologist discovering it and misinterpreting it as a fertility ritual. Historians still argue, someone nearby says, whether the Vestals were fashion subversives or just bored. Probably both. Meanwhile, at the gymnasium, men train in tunics noticeably shorter than regulation. When questioned, they insist it's for aerodynamic leg freedom. A philosopher lounging nearby, half drunk on mulled wine, declares, "The soul can only ascend if the knees are unburdened." No one questions him. He has a beard and a scroll. That counts as authority. You return home by twilight, clutching a few bolts of suspiciously swirled cloth and a small jar of contraband orange, dye that smells like pomegranates and civic disobedience. The light in your atrium flickers as dusk settles over the rooftops. You sit down with a visiting cousin, who claims she witnessed a senator this morning, giving a speech while wearing what appeared to be an entire curtain, pleated, tasseled, and possibly perfumed. He called it the people's drapery, got a standing ovation. Your cousin snorts into her cup of barley beer. "It's madness," she says. "Beautiful madness." You both sit in companionable silence, staring into the courtyard fountain. A bird splashes in the water, scattering droplets like spilled pigment across the stone. For a moment, you imagine those droplets shaping themselves into garments, fluid, free, and always shifting, like Rome herself. Later that night, as torches are extinguished and the streets fall into velvet shadow, you hear faint music drifting from an alley, a lone flutist practicing a new tune, slow and looping. It sounds like someone tiptoeing over cobblestones. You lie in bed, wrapped in a robe you've refolded 3 times just to get the angle right. Not flashy, not dangerous, just expressive. You think of the Council of Decorative Moderation and wonder what their official insignia will look like. A folded napkin, a toga draped over a balance scale, a shrug. It doesn't matter. What matters is that Rome is still humming, still folding, still unfolding. You drift off slowly, your dreams filled with layered silk skies and chariot wheels spinning like dropped spools of thread. When you wake the next day, you half expect to find Rome in full toga chaos, streets clogged with clashing pleats, and desperate vendors selling pop-up folding tutorials to confuse tourists from Britannia. But no, instead, you open your shutters to a quiet calm, a kind of gentle post-drama stillness that settles on a city once it's collectively decided to move on, without exactly admitting it. There are still signs, of course. A toga draped a bit too boldly here, a merchant stall flying silk banners that flirt with illegality, but somehow manage to avoid it through vague language like recreational wrapping accessories. You dress slowly, not out of caution, but because it's become a kind of ritual now. Folding your tunic just right, considering, but ultimately rejecting, the new purple-trimmed belt you bought yesterday. Maybe tomorrow. Today you're keeping it quiet. The emperor hasn't made another announcement yet. And in Rome, silence from above can mean peace, or it can mean someone's about to invent a whole new category of garment crimes. Your first stop is the public baths, where gossip flows thicker than the steam. You ease into the warm water, the scent of cedar and lemon balm in the air. Conversations swirl around you, bits of idle complaint mixed with cautious optimism. Did you see Gaius yesterday? Full peacock feathers on his shoulder fold. Bold, Very bold, risky, might get him appointed to the council just so they can keep an eye on him. You close your eyes and float, half listening. Across the way, two elderly men are debating the semiotics of sleeve length as it pertains to civic loyalty. One swears shorter sleeves suggest Republican sympathies, while the other insists they simply reflect changing weather patterns. You decide not to interrupt. Let them have this. After all, historians still argue whether these micro-fashion signals actually influenced political perception or were just eccentric byproducts of a very theatrical culture. Later, in the marketplace, you pass a new stall, clearly a pop-up, offering toga revision services. The vendor, a sprightly woman with sun-creased eyes and 10 fingers that move like snakes through cloth, promises to adjust your look to avoid suspicion while maintaining maximum elegance. A sign beside her reads, "Respectable folding. Only, no backlacing, no shoulder origami, no questions." You buy a bronze clasp from her shaped like a modest snail and attach it to your sash. It feels like a quiet act of solidarity. On the steps of the Temple of Concord, a street poet is performing a new ode titled Ballad of the Band Togas. His voice carries just enough mockery to entertain without crossing into arrest-worthy territory. Oh, draped delight, once free to twirl, now bound by scroll and Senate snarl. A small crowd claps politely, then immediately disperses in case applause gets redefined as insubordination. That afternoon, you visit a friend who works as a junior scribe for the Department of Civic Aesthetics, a new bureau hastily invented last week in the wake of the toga drama. She welcomes you with a raised eyebrow and 2 cups of watered fig wine. Do you know we've already had to review 43 proposed legal definitions of decorative restraint, she says, rolling her eyes. One senator tried to ban anything that swishes. You choke on your wine. Swishes? Like the sound? She nods. Apparently it makes him nervous. He says it disrupts public seriousness. You both stare at each other, then burst out laughing. Your friend pulls out a stack of draft edicts, each more absurd than the last. Look at this. No citizen shall wear a fold wider than the length of a standard goose. What does that even mean? Whose goose? Somewhere in the corner, a clerk is quietly drawing toga diagrams shaped like birds. You suspect he's not getting paid enough. In the evening, you pass a group of actors rehearsing in a courtyard. They're putting on a play called The Toga Trials, a thinly veiled satire where every character is named after a different fold style. There's drama, betrayal, and a surprise appearance by a character simply known as the Sash. The costumes are exaggerated on purpose, all glitter and floppy layers, but no one dares shut them down. The crowd laughs, a little too loud, a little too long. Laughter can be armor in times like these. You join them, seated on a warm marble ledge as night rolls in and the torches flicker. One of the actors notices your snail clasp and winks. Symbol of patience, he says. Or passive rebellion. You smile. Both. He laughs. Well played. On the way home, you pass a patrol of city watchmen wearing entirely regulation tunics, neither tight nor flamboyant, but you can see it in their eyes. They're exhausted. You overhear one whisper to the other, "If I have to inspect one more pleat tonight, I'm going to defect to the Carthaginian embassy and take up sculpting." His partner sighs. At least sculptors don't argue about fabric tension. You keep walking, resisting the urge to invite them both to tomorrow's underground toga folding contest, an informal event held in someone's wine cellar, judged by a retired midwife with strong opinions about symmetry. You'll probably go, or not. Who knows what tomorrow will bring? Rome may issue another scroll, or maybe it won't. Maybe things will stay just confusing enough to keep people busy, but not scary. That's the Roman sweet spot. As you arrive, home, the wind picks up slightly, rustling your robe. You glance at your reflection in a polished bronze tray. Folds crisp, clasp secure. Expression somewhere between mischievous and relieved. You're not breaking any laws. Not exactly. And maybe that's the point now. Everyone performing this shared balancing act, improvising dignity through fabric and humor. You lie down, breathing in the scent of laundry herbs drying by the window. The distant sound of street music lulls you, someone playing a slow dirge on the panpipes, likely a merchant-turned-minstrel who decided fashion law enforcement wasn't his calling. You wonder what the emperor is dreaming about. Probably nothing, as interesting as you. You wake to the sound of distant flutes and the muted groaning of oxen wheels dragging market carts down the cobbled street. Morning in Rome always carries a particular fragrance. Baking bread, damp limestone, and whatever incense the local temple priests are experimenting with today. You stretch, shift the linen blanket off your shoulders, and once again marvel at how a city can both collapse and flourish in the same breath. Outside, the fabric restrictions haven't been officially revoked, but the enforcement seems to be thinning, like watered-down wine. The guards now check more for theatrical posturing than actual textiles. If you're discreet, if you don't pose with too much flair or allow your folds to billow poetically on the breeze, you're safe. At least for now. Today is market day. You tie your sash with the subtlety of a cat burglar and head out, passing a mural that someone has cheekily updated with chalk. A statue of Minerva now sports a very avant-garde toga twist, complete with dramatic flaring sleeves. Below it, a scrawled caption reads, "Who polices the gods?" A philosophical question the Senate has no plans to answer. You make your way through the forum, where produce vendors now sell their fruit with slogans like ethically sourced and modestly draped grapes. You're particularly amused by a new trend. Fold consultants, fashionable citizens who now rent out their expertise in safe but stylish wrapping. One young man, barely into his 20s, stands near the cheese stall offering express fold tuning for 2 sesterces. He eyes your outfit and gives a small, approving nod. Tasteful, not too rebellious, not too submissive. You tip him a coin anyway. Sometimes we all need to be told we're doing okay. Further down the lane, you notice a scribe seated on a folding stool, busily copying down scrolls. You recognize her. She's compiling public reactions to the toga drama for a historian who believes future generations will find this all deeply important. You hope she's right. Rome has a way of remembering its most ridiculous debates with more reverence than its wars. She tells you about a senator who recently tried to push through an amendment stating that all official garments must be able to withstand a moderate breeze without revealing inner contours. You don't ask what qualifies as a moderate breeze. No one really wants to know. You offer her a fig and ask what else the scrolls are saying. She flips through a pile. A baker wrote in to say the restrictions have improved his business because people are eating more in stress. A stonemason claims tighter clothing makes public statues feel misrepresented. And a child, this is my favorite, sent in a drawing of a lizard wearing a toga with the caption, "He's just doing his best." You both laugh, the kind of weary laughter that glues civilization together. Near the old aqueduct, a group of philosophers have gathered, not because they've been invited, but because public space is their natural habitat. They're engaged in heated debate about whether fashion laws are a legitimate extension of civic morality or a sign of declining governance. One particularly loud fellow insists that the ban is a secret code designed to test loyalty. Another argues that the emperor is merely bored and entertaining himself. You hover at the edge of the group, listening. One philosopher, older, quieter, leans over and says to you, "You know, Socrates never wore a toga, claimed it interfered with his thinking." You're about to ask whether that's true when he continues, "Historians still argue whether that's because he hated togas or because he couldn't afford one. Either way, he died with very free thighs." You raise your eyebrows. "Free thighs?" He shrugs. "It's a metaphor. Probably. Philosophy in Rome is half logic, half theatre, and no one ever keeps score." The midday heat drives you toward the shade of a basilica where a small art exhibition is taking place. The theme? Unfolding Rome. Paintings, tapestries, even sculpture, each piece a subtle or not so subtle nod to the great toga disruption. One statue depicts a senator mid-pose, clutching a scroll in one hand and dramatically holding up the hem of his toga in the other, as if preparing to sprint or flee or dance. Another painting shows a lineup of Roman citizens with captions like the rebel, the realist, the reluctant, and the one who didn't get the memo. In the corner, a bust of the emperor has been adorned with a tiny felt barrette and a sign that reads, "Interpretive Garment Optional." You're not sure how long this exhibit will be allowed to remain, but it's drawing steady crowds. Maybe art is the city's most acceptable form of protest. That evening, you're invited to a modest dinner party hosted by a merchant whose wine trade has recently been upended. Less due to politics, more because his nephew attempted to create a foldable wine decanter and accidentally poisoned 2 minor officials. "No lasting harm," he says cheerfully as he pours your cup. The guests are a mixed crowd. Artists, low-ranking senators, a woman who trains messenger pigeons. The conversation flits from politics to pigeons to perfumed olive oil. At one point, someone begins telling a ghost story about a toga that refuses to lay flat and instead coils like a snake around its wearer's limbs. It's meant to be silly, but you notice everyone glancing at their clothing just a bit more nervously than before. Later, as the sun sets and lamps are lit with flickering flame, the merchant raises a toast. "To Rome," he says, "where even the strangest laws become fashion statements." You raise your cup in agreement, the wine sweet and sharp on your tongue. Someone begins humming a folk tune. Someone else begins to dance, slowly, their garments swirling in carefully measured arcs. No one calls them out. For a moment, everyone simply watches, mesmerized by the movement, by the way the folds catch the candlelight like ripples on a calm lake. On your way home, the streets are quiet. A few lanterns bob in the distance. You spot a boy sketching with charcoal on a wall. His lines are confident, playful. When you pass by again the next morning, you'll see what he was drawing. A stylized toga shaped like a bird in flight, its wings wrapped but not restrained, flapping just enough to suggest freedom. Maybe the emperor will see it. Maybe he'll smile. Or maybe he'll declare war on birds. With Rome, it's always a possibility. You wake the next morning to a strange stillness. Rome is rarely quiet, even at dawn. There's usually something. Vendors practicing their pitch, roosters in heated competition, clattering from the bakeries, or at the very least a philosophical drunk arguing with a statue. But today, there's a hush that makes you pause. You step onto the street, dressed as always with quiet intent, the folds of your toga arranged in the newest version of what's come to be known as provisionally acceptable drapery. A local boy passes you, holding a basket of figs, and whispers, "They say the emperor's making an announcement." He doesn't stop running. You raise your eyebrows and follow the direction others seem to be flowing toward. The Forum once, again becoming Rome's unofficial amphitheatre of chaos and spectacle. There, in the centre, a stage has been hastily erected. It's more of a platform than a proper stage, stacked planks surrounded by guards, some of whom appear more curious than vigilant. On the makeshift podium, a herald in gleaming bronze armour holds a scroll as if it weighs more than it should. He clears his throat and begins. "Citizens of Rome, His Imperial Majesty, may his toga always be correctly belted, has issued a revision to the previous decree on civic attire, effective immediately." Everyone leans in. Those garments, deemed inappropriately suggestive, provocatively contoured, or excessively pleated, shall be prohibited within 100 paces of any government building, temple, or public bath. A low murmur spreads across the crowd like ripples from a skipped stone. It's not a repeal, it's a redirection. You glance around. The faces tell the whole story. The law hasn't vanished. It's been domesticated, corralled to the zones of bureaucracy and solemnity. Outside those zones, interpretations may vary. One older woman with a basket of onions mutters, "Does my house count if I do taxes there?" Another merchant just shrugs. Baths and bureaucracy, I'll just be fabulous in between. The herald continues, reading with the crisp, blank neutrality of someone who's had too much practice at not caring. The rest of the edict includes several new terms: strategic moderation, civic modesty zones, and a particularly baffling phrase, pleat neutrality, which no one fully understands but everyone pretends to. Once the announcement ends, the crowd disperses like a stirred pot of lentils. The chaos resumes, with slightly more eye-rolling and fewer straight lines. You wander into a shaded alley, seeking reprieve from the sudden flood of opinion and confusion. There, tucked behind an herb seller's stall, is your old friend Galerius, the tailor who's been simultaneously avoiding and navigating this mess better than anyone. He's humming as he works, stitching what looks like a robe for a statue. "For Mars," he says casually. The priests want him to appear less confrontational. You squint at the robe. It's made of hemp and cloud-coloured linen. He grins. Peaceful conquest. You sit beside him as he folds and tucks, fingers moving like water. He tells you of his latest clients: a poet who wanted a toga that visually represented melancholy, a lawyer who needed one with non-verbal legal strength, and a teenage girl who requested the opposite of whatever the emperor wears. Galerius sighs. Fashion is rebellion, always has been. But rebellion in Rome has to be washable. As he works, you spot a scroll tucked in his fabric bin. He notices your glance. "Ah," he says, "the new imperial guidelines. Just released. They include illustrations." He unrolls it, and you see detailed sketches of approved pleating zones, ideal fold density, and bizarrely, a diagram of a citizen running, marked either as too free or properly restrained, depending on the leg exposure. You study it for a while, trying to decide if the state has become a theatre company or if Rome has always been one. Galerius offers you a fresh stitch line. Historians still argue whether the emperor's motivations were aesthetic, moral, or simply born of boredom. But look at the effort. This level of detail, that's not governance. That's couture with delusions of empire. You take a walk after lunch. The city is reacting in real time. Some citizens now carry measuring cords to ensure they remain precisely 100 paces from a temple before adjusting their drape. Others have adopted a system of emergency outer layers, portable capes that can be whipped on the moment you approach a restricted zone. You pass a troupe of amateur actors performing a satire in the street, dressed in exaggeratedly oversized togas that trail behind them like bridal trains. The scene includes a judge, a priest, and a confused goat, all wrapped in progressively more absurd layers. The audience howls with laughter. You get the sense that this, more than protest, is how Rome resists, through ridicule and relentless creativity. You stop by the baths that evening, not to soak, but to listen. Baths are Rome's social bloodstream, and tonight they are bubbling with opinion. Two patricians argue near the hot room about whether the emperor has overstepped or merely refined the cultural tapestry. Nearby, a slave girl reenacts the new law, using soap and towel folds for a crowd that cannot stop laughing. Even in whispers, it's clear. Most citizens have accepted the restriction zones as an invitation to play the rest of the city like a stage. One man announces he'll now only wear band pleats in his sleep, calling it dream resistance. Another says he's inventing a cloak that unfolds into a tent with legally neutral drapery. Somewhere between the hot stone benches and the cold plunge, you hear the phrase garment diplomacy for the first time. Rome is adapting, not quietly, but artistically. On your way home, a boy runs past you shouting, "Pleat-free zone ahead." He's right, the temple looms in the distance. You casually tighten your wrap and smile to yourself. The city has turned a restriction into a scavenger hunt, a joke, a performance art piece, and an opportunity for pocket-sized disobedience. In any other place, this would mark chaos. In Rome, it's Tuesday. The moon is high by the time you reach your doorway. You look down at your toga, creased in places, rebellious in others. You wonder if one day archaeologists will find these folds and argue about their meaning, if future scholars will try to decode the crease angle as a form of political speech. Maybe they'll be right. Maybe they'll just be very tired. Either way, you chuckle softly as you unpin your brooch. Today, at least, you were exactly 101 paces away from everything that mattered. You wake the next morning, roll yourself out of a blanket that has somehow become more toga than bed cover, and find yourself already dreading the simple act of dressing. Not because you dislike clothing, Rome, for all its faults, certainly knows how to drape a person, but because the decision now feels less like fashion and more like a minor act of diplomacy. As you tug your tunic into place and begin the careful origami of today's toga, you remember what Galerius said about fashion being rebellion. Today, you decide your rebellion will involve a pleat, just one, discreetly placed at the hip, small enough to ignore but just irregular enough to make a point. It feels silly, but then again, so does almost everything lately. You step into the sunlight and walk toward the Suburra, Rome's bustling, chaotic neighborhood that always feels a little too crowded, a little too noisy, and somehow a little too alive to be anything but essential. Here, the emperor's decree has taken on an entirely new interpretation. In the Suburra, rules arrive late and are usually accompanied by jokes. Vendors have begun advertising zone-legal robes, which come with strings of measurement beads and certificates approved by at least one literate, official-looking person. One shop has a sale on cloaks labeled Imperial Confusion Ready. A street artist has painted a mural of the emperor himself, wrapped in an endless scroll of lore chased by a toga that grows sentient. It's clear that while the upper tiers of society are nervously modifying their wardrobe with agonizing precision, the common folk are responding with a mix of wit, apathy, and entrepreneurial instinct. You pass a young woman in an aggressively oversized tunic that drags behind her like a bridal train. She smirks when she sees your pleat and gives you a wink. Code, it seems, for I see what you did there. At the market, a heated discussion is unfolding between two fishmongers. One insists that only formal togas are subject to the decree. The other swears that any form of decorative hemming now constitutes intentional seduction. A third person, a passerby with more onions than interest, suggests the emperor is just mad because his tailor quit. Historians, after all, still argue whether this whole mess began as a moral stance or as the fallout of a badly fitted garment. Either way, Rome is adapting in the most Roman way possible, by bickering, joking, and accidentally reinventing street fashion. You duck into a stall to escape the debate and find yourself browsing a collection of tunics embroidered with cryptic symbols. The seller tells you they're inspired by ancient Etruscan motifs, but vaguely shaped like a middle finger when viewed from above. You buy too. You spend the afternoon weaving through side streets, catching snippets of conversations that all seem to orbit the same ridiculous sun. One man is convinced the emperor is preparing to launch a Togarum Index, a formal registry of approved and banned folds. Another swears he overheard a palace servant saying the emperor is now consulting astrologers to determine the correct number of pleats based on one's birth sign. A baker has created a new dessert, flaky, layered, and utterly confusing, called the fold. It's filled with honey and spice and served with a sly smile. When you ask about the name, the baker shrugs. Just a pastry, he says. But if the emperor hates it, that's a bonus. The sense of satire in the city is growing, not in angry protests, but in sly nudges and clever subversions. You wonder how long the palace can ignore this quiet storm of creativity. As twilight sets in, you walk along the edge of the Palatine Hill, where the homes of the elite shimmer in the dusk like smug, silent ships. Here, compliance is stricter. You pass patricians so stiffly draped they look embalmed. One man's toga is so heavily starched it crackles with each step. Their households are holding drills, actual drills, on proper toga deployment. Slaves and stewards practice emergency refolding protocols. One domus has even hired an aesthetic consultant who is rumored to have worked on temple curtain design. You can't decide if this is absurd or impressive, perhaps both. Inside these grand homes The decree has become something else entirely, a means of competing, of displaying one's mastery not just of wealth, but of cultural compliance. They treat it as a tournament. And yet even here, small resistances peek through. A single crimson border, a daring asymmetry, an embroidered proverb on the inner lining. All quiet acts of sartorial defiance, subtle enough to be dismissed as accidents but intentional all the same. You find yourself at the edge of a dinner party being held in one such home. The doors are open, the laughter spills out like perfume, and you recognize one of the guests, a senator you once overheard misquote Cicero while sneezing. Tonight, he's wearing something curious, a toga that, while appearing proper from the front, opens in the back to reveal a tunic covered in irreverent graffiti. One of the phrases, crudely drawn near his shoulder blade, reads, "Long live the foldless." He catches your eye, winks, and turns quickly. It hits you then. Even within the emperor's own circle, the law is unraveling. Not in flames or fury, but in quiet rebellion and in-jokes no law can quite pin down. You walk home under a moonfat with light. The city feels less tense now. Not because the decree has been forgotten, it hasn't, but because the people have absorbed it, reshaped it, and made it ridiculous. That's how Rome often wins. Not by direct confrontation, but by parody, by laughing rules out of power. It doesn't happen overnight, but slowly, over days and dinners and debates about fishmongers' pleats. The edge is blunted. You think of that first week, of the fury and confusion, and now look around at a city that's turned a crisis into comedy. Even the statues look like they're smirking. As you step into your doorway, you glance down at your toga, still pleated, still illegal, technically, but no one stopped you today. You exhale, soft and amused. Somewhere in the city, someone else is trying a new fold. Someone else is sewing a hidden joke into their hemline. You suspect tomorrow will be more of the same, and that somehow is comforting.